They tried to run me down in the dark. That's the sentence that woke me up 3 days later, when I could finally say it out loud without my hands shaking. It's also the sentence I use when people ask why I don't camp alone anymore. Plain, stupid, blunt. The kind of sentence that tells you everything you need to know and nothing at all. This video is 5 of those sentences stretched into long nights. 5 terrifying true stories of camping alone in the woods, told by people who were there. Names are changed. Dates are fuzzy. What isn't fuzzy is the way the woods can go from quiet to dangerous in the space of a cigarette flick or a truck headlight. These are listener submissions. Years of solo trips and stupid choices and luck that sometimes ran out for other people. I'll give you context for each. Where we were, why we were alone, what made the hairs on the back of our necks stand up, and what we learned, if anything, after the lights came back on. Keep in mind these are real people with real scars. I'll be blunt when I need to be, but I won't trade trauma for clicks. Story 1 starts with a breakup and ends with a vehicle barreling toward a tent. The narrator calls her ex Erin. The family that moved in next to her is only ever the Johnsons. That's how they'll be here. Pseudonyms, impressions, the things we remembered in the dark. I'd been in love with bad timing for most of my 20s, and breakup season hit me like every film scene where the protagonist drives away with a broken stereo and a soundtrack that refuses to quit. Erin left. I left my apartment like I was ejecting old files, suitcase, worn hoodie, a book I pretended to read, and I drove to a place that had nothing to do with Erin, a lakeside campsite I'd been to a dozen times, the one with the broken swing over the mossy bank and the shower that took apart your hair. It was early fall. The air had that knife-edge cold that smells like leaves and things beginning to rot. Perfect for someone who wanted to sleep alone and not have to explain why they were staring into a fire. I'd picked the same spot I always picked, because there's comfort in repetition. A little ridge behind my tent, so the breeze came in the right way. An old fallen log to act as a table. I set up quietly, made a tiny fire, and drank too much instant coffee. I told myself I'd cry, and that would be the catharsis. Instead, I drifted into a weird kind of vigilance, emotional exhaustion with a side of watchfulness. Alone didn't feel like peace. Alone felt like a test I hadn't studied for. Sometime after dusk, maybe an hour, maybe 2, another family pulled into the site next to mine. You could tell when a family campsite moved in. Voices, the clatter of coolers, a child's laughter that cut through the stillness like a bell. I saw them first by the orange glow of their lantern, an old pickup with a camper shell, 2 kids dragging something that looked like a plastic boat, and a woman whose voice rode above the rest, like she was used to being listened to. The man, Mr. Johnson, by the way he carried himself, moved around the truck with a sort of precise anger that made my jaw tighten without me meaning to. At first it was the usual, greetings, nods, the polite distance of campsites. They set up too close, which should have been my first clue. Not just adjacent, close enough that when they laughed it felt like it echoed inside my tent. The kids ran and shrieked, the woman made coffee, and the man walked the perimeter like he was measuring the land for property lines only he could see. If you've ever been the awkward single person at a family cookout, you know this energy. Looks that catalogue everything about you, your gear, your shoes, your choices. I shrugged it off. Why not? People are people. I'd also had a drink or 2 and the kind of self-pity that feels almost romantic in the failing light. I told myself to be friendly, better to be seen than to disappear. So I offered them extra firewood. The woman accepted with a nod and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That small transaction is lodged in my memory because it felt like the last moment of civility. Over the next day, things shifted. I'm not dramatic. Well, not always. But there was a pattern. A voice raised to reprimand a kid for dropping a marshmallow, then another voice answering back with a sarcasm sharpened by alcohol. The kids were told to be quiet, and they did for a time, but at dusk, the father got louder. He would stand in front of his rig and shout at someone on the phone with a tone that had teeth. Once, I heard him call someone a worthless sack so casually that the phrase rolled into the tree line. It lodged there. That night, after my small fire burned down to embers, and I'd shoved my sleeping pad into what I thought was the safe hollow of my bag, the noise crescendoed. The Johnsons were arguing, full-throated, All caps anger. The kids were quiet. In my head, I imagined what we all wanted to avoid, physical escalation. I told myself to mind my business. I tried to sleep. That's when the shouting turned violent. I should be careful with words here. I don't want to sensationalize what I let myself see. The man dragged something, I'm still not sure what, across their sight, slamming it down, his movements loud and humiliating. He screamed at the woman, calling her names that sounded old and familiar and mean. The lantern threw giant shadows, and when one of their kids walked toward him, the father yanked the kid back so hard the child stumbled against the truck. The mother screamed something, and I heard the sound of a can hitting the gravel. A small thing, but in that moment it felt like a match being struck. I ducked behind my tent, watching through its small opening, because you know the forest teaches us curious things, timing angles where shadows hide the truth. The Johnson's fire went up bigger. Someone poured something on a smaller pile, and it exploded into life. It looked reckless, like ritual. The father started cursing the road for rattling his truck. Then he pushed something into the fire with a long stick. Sparks flew up into the night like small incandescent insects. I thought maybe he was burning trash. Maybe. I was wrong. An hour later, at about 2 in the morning, headlights blinked on along the dirt road, and then dimmed toward where the Johnsons were. I thought perhaps someone was returning or a neighbor checking in. The headlights settled across their sight with that flat wash of white, too bright like a discovery light. I got up because you get up in those moments. You have a body reactions file you can't turn off when survival tastes like possibility. I moved slowly, clutching the small flashlight I kept for emergencies. It felt like a prop in a bad movie, but I kept it anyway. The headlights were on a 404 that idled like a beast, too close, its grill and tires just beyond the Johnsons' camp. The father was shouting at the air now, his hands cutting through darkness, and someone in the truck answered him quietly. Faux silhouette stepped out from the passenger side and walked toward them. The father looked at the truck and then... God, this is the part I still replay. He pointed right at my tent. For a moment I thought I had been seen and the pointing was a casual acknowledgement. Then the truck backed up. Not a slow retreat, a shove. It revved and backed as if inviolable ground meant nothing. The headlights painted the trees, the small lake flashing like a coin in the dark. And the truck's reverse lights were a stare. The father turned as if to measure his audience. The man in the truck slapped his thigh and nodded. They aimed the truck at my tent. There's a peculiar bone-deep understanding you get in an instant when a machine like that is about to kill you, or at least try. There was no time for very much thinking. I grabbed my spare gas can, not because it was tactical, stupid maybe, and I ran, straight toward the lake. The truck hit gravel and the sound was an animal. It was like the night swallowed a drum. The backfiring was loud. Someone screamed. I ran past my tent, grabbed a corner of the fly because I couldn't leave every piece of me behind, and dove over a rotten log into the low brush near the water. They came at me with horns of light and male laughter that scraped like rocks. The truck moved faster, fishtailing in the gravel. I thought absurdly about how stupid this felt. Me, a grown woman, flung into a ditch while someone in a truck decided if I had the right to exist. I had the presence of mind for one good thing. My old phone was in my hand. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely dial, but I hit 911 and said what I could. They're trying to run me over. And then someone yanked on my jacket. It's possible that in other tellings the father is painted as the lone monster. The truth is messier. Voices, lights, men yelling and laughing like predators in a pack. The truck stopped short of the tent by maybe a gnarled foot. A scream cut through, and the mother was at the edge of their sight, cupped in her hand, saying words to someone that were all pleading. No one was anyone's hero that night. I heard the engine rev, heard a truck back up and disappear on the road like a bad dream with an annoying beep. I crawled back to my tent. The Johnsons had started a fire on the far side of their site, and it was bigger than it should have been, too close to my gear, spreading little embers toward the dry leaves. I grabbed the canvas of my tent, slapped at the embers like I was smothering a cat. Adrenaline gave me a kind of clean, practical strength. I stomped at the fire, spilled water from my cooker, and managed to put most of it out. When I called the sheriff, I was asked the usual slow questions, names, vehicle description, but I didn't have a plate, and their descriptions were shaky and tinted with residual adrenaline. The dispatcher promised to look into it. They said someone might be in the area. In the morning, there was no patrol car when I packed up. No one showed. The Johnsons were gone. People asked me if I called Erin. I didn't. What would I say? Hey, I survived a night you missed. The split between what we imagine and what we do is strange. I drove away with a tow truck of feelings, a sense of gratitude that I could walk, and a deeper recognition that the woods, for all their beauty, are a stage for other people's violence. That night taught me something blunt. Being alone makes you vulnerable, not just to nature, but to the choices of those around you. I stopped romanticizing the solo trip. If you like these, hit subscribe. More real stories every week. That jab of an ad breaks the tension, and yes, it's small and shameless, but also true. If you're into this, there's a trove of others. Anyway, back to the woods. The second story starts somewhere in the Adirondacks, which is the kind of place where you expect to find bear-proof bins and people trying to be wholesome on Instagram. The narrator, a long-distance kind of hiker who'd been solo a dozen times, thought she was going to have a peaceful trek to clear her head. She found something else, trees drilled like faucets, a smell like sugar under rot, and a man who appeared to be sucking sap. I say this out loud and it still feels ridiculous. It's the kind of thing you imagine as a caricature. An eccentric, wild-eyed man living his truth with a hand drill and a straw. But the person who told me this, call her Lena, swore it happened the way she said. Lena was methodical about hiking. Early starts, light pack, plenty of water. That day she took a trail deeper than usual, the kind with split rails and no foot traffic. The sky was low and clean. The trees were raw with last summer's wounds. It was quiet enough you could almost hear the sap move up through the trunks. She noticed the holes first. At eye level, neat circular depressions, as if someone had used a drill bit to tap into the tree. The dull dust pooled at each base like spilled sawdust. Sap stained the bark below each hollow, dark and a little tacky to the touch. At first she assumed poachers, people removing trail markers or doing some strange craft. Then she caught the smell, sweet, like a jar of maple syrup left in the sun for too long. It hung in the air and made her tongue feel oddly sticky. At the next hairline bend, on a half-hidden slope where the footpath walled the world off, she saw movement. A mass of hair anchored the brush. The man was enormous. Not tall in a loping, handsome way, but wide, with shoulders that had no excuse. He wore a trucker cap and a stained flannel, and he held a hand drill in one hand like a boy would hold a toy sword. He crouched in front of a tree as if feeding. As ridiculous as it sounds, he had a tube in his mouth and the other end plunged into a fresh hole in the trunk. She watched as he leaned his weight into his chin and created suction. Everything about that image refuses to look sensible. He made a sound while he did it, a low, almost animal sound of contentment. He looked like a man at prayer to the wrong god. Lena froze because, in that absolute second where you decide to be witness or victim, motion is the loudest sin. She let a twig snap. The sound was nothing by a forest metric, but to that man it was a detonator. He dropped the drill, abandoned the tree like someone waking from a trance, and turned toward her. He was on her before she had a plan. She says he charged with a speed that didn't match his size, brandishing the drill like a stick. She ran because there was nothing else to do. The chase was the part of her story she told with clipped, breathless sentences, small pieces of panic collaged together. He was faster than I thought. I thought he'd trip. He didn't. The drill whined. My shoe caught a root. I scraped my shin. I ran. She ran hard, down a slope and through brush, cutting in the shadow of pines where the air felt like wool under her arms. At one point, she says she looked back and saw the man standing at the tree stump, the drill catching the last stragglers of light. He didn't pursue further. Maybe he gave up. Maybe the hole in the tree was the only devotional object he had. Maybe he called out something that could have been a warning or a prayer. Lena didn't listen because the whole thing had the structure of a nightmare where you obey only to the point of survival. She made it to her car after what felt like hours. Her lungs had that shallow, metallic taste you get from extreme panic. She drove off and never went back to that section of trail. She filed a report with the Park Service, who wrote it down with the polite, unable to help patience of bureaucrats. They asked if she'd gotten a plate number. She hadn't. They told her they'd send someone to check out the area. She never saw anyone in the trees, not again. In her coda, she told me what lingered. Not so much fear of the man, who could have been a loner with quirks, and loneliness does strange things, but the idea that the forest could house such oddness, and that people we imagine as civilized could suddenly seem like wild animals. There are zones where social norms become thin and fragile, and the woods are one of them. Lena started bringing bear spray. She started timing her hikes with other people. She traded a little solitude for peace. After those two, after the truck that nearly crushed a tent and the man with a drill and a taste for tree sap, you begin to expect the woods to have a script. Weirdness, menace, flight. But the third story, the one about the dining table, breaks whatever rulebook you thought the forest kept. This one begins with an off-trail wanderer, call him Marco, who liked to push deeper after dark to find solitude and things the guidebooks didn't mention. Marco was one of those long-distance wanderers who treats the map like a suggestion and has a knack for finding the wrong thing in the right place. One late summer evening, he picked a place to stop far off the beaten path and found, sitting in the middle of nowhere like an accusation, a full dining table. Not a picnic table, a dining table. 4 carved chairs, a tablecloth hanging askew, plates stacked as if someone had been interrupted mid-meal. The wood was rotten at the edges, fungus having turned the legs into something more like lace than lumber. Silverware lay scattered. A bottle, glass green, half full, caught the sun and threw a green flicker across the underbrush. The whole set looked like a stage prop from a play where no one showed up to act. Marco's first thought was prank. Someone had to have carried it out there, right? Someone with a van and a chain and no shame. He circled the area and found no path that would reasonably transport a dining set, no tire tracks, nothing. The place had a silence to it that made his skin ripple. He set up his tent close enough to keep an eye on the table and camped. It felt like camping inside a conspiracy. Night came with the usual, crickets, a soft wind moving across the field, but not long after dark he heard voices, too human and too close to be the wind. They weren't arguing softly. They were talking in that kind of low-voiced business, where men discuss things that cannot be loud, the sound of bottles being passed and glasses clinking. He sat up so hard his tent creaked. He unzipped and slid out, moving like someone trying to be part of a ghost story without volunteering for the role. The voices were clearer now. 4 men, he thought, at the table, their silhouettes lit by a lantern. They were eating. They were also laughing in that dangerous way men laugh when they share wrongdoing like a private joke. Marco hid in a shallow ditch a few yards off, the cold earth pressing into his ribs. He pulled a beat-up flashlight into his jacket and pressed himself down, heart loud as a hammer in an empty room. What he overheard is the part that has the teeth. The men, in low voices, said things that circled around the word body without embellishment. They used euphemisms, the deer or the load, and then slipped into practicalities, where to put something heavy, what to do with a smell, how to burn or bury without drawing attention. One of them described in an almost casual manner how they'd disposed of something else last winter. Meat, bones, what you do when you don't want to get caught. Marco told me he felt his face go numb, because you can process a forest tragedy in paragraphs, but listening to men go about logistics makes the world lean wrong. He stayed frozen. He listened as they mentioned a location far off a logging road, their voices lowering when they mentioned a name he'd seen on a faded map. One of them said, "We'll take care of it like we always do," and the word always sat in the air like a promise. Marco says his bladder betrayed him. This is important because it's a human tick that can blow any stealth plan. So he held it and rehearsed his options. Run to his car, call 911 and hope someone listened, or wait and maybe hear a name that could turn suspicion into evidence. He waited. The men joked, they argued, they drank. At some point one of them stood and walked a slow circle around the table, touching a chair, a ritualizing touch as if their crimes deserved ceremonial recognition. The lantern bleated. A moth smacked itself to death against the glass. Marco could feel his body going to sleep while his mind insisted he be awake. Hours stretched. The men's talk grew ragged with drinking. There's a particular kind of terror that comes from overhearing other people plot and realizing you're invisible to them, but exposed to them. Marco felt both expendable and essential, an accidental witness with no footprint and no plan. He knew, in a way that is not rational, that these men could smell watershed trouble like hounds smell blood. He started to crawl away, careful and slow, then froze when a chair scraped back. One of the men was coming toward the trees, toward where Marco had been hiding. Footsteps crackled. A voice muttered something like, "I thought I heard a twig." The moth's wings beat the last against the lantern. Marco had a choice in that moment that was almost a rubric of survival. He could run, he could call out and reveal himself as a witness. He could throw a stone and hope for the miraculous. Or he could stay as still as autumn itself and wait to be discovered. He told me he did what people do when their brains go to the default setting. He stayed. Air in his throat stopped. A fox could have had him, and he'd have made the same decision. The man's foot fell near the ditch, and then paused. You can hear the pause in Marco's telling. It's long, and it smells like adrenaline. The man breathed, and for a tiny second, the ditch was a room, the table, the altar. Then the man moved on. Or he didn't. That's the precise point where Marco's story shifts from a slow creep to a breaking point. He lay there for what felt like an hour, then another, and eventually the sounds spread thin. When the men left, the table lay like a thing someone had used to hide something ugly. Marco didn't call the police until morning. He drove out like a man who'd been out of his mind. The officers he did find were polite and slow, writing notes, asking if he was sure. He used the words, "I think they mentioned a body." That is the phrase that keeps the rest of the system honest. I think. It's a cautious phrase that keeps one from criminalizing the uncertain. The officers tamped down the heat. They said they'd look, maybe send a unit. Marco left with a leftover buzzing in his ears, and a certainty that he'd been very close to something unspeakable. He went home and stopped going off trail. Not because he didn't want solitude, he said, but because the table in the middle of nowhere proved that people can make the wilderness into a private theater for things you do not want to season. He started to wonder about the things people carry into the woods. Axes, chains, grudges. He started sleeping with a light in his hall even at midday. And this is where I'll stop for now. The ditch breathing cold with a man's foot above it, the green bottle, the table like an accusation. There are two more stories to tell. One about a woman camping under an overpass who fights her attacker until the world blurs, and a last one about a man in a suit who might have been lost, might have been dangerous, and who left questions the narrator never stopped thinking about. Those two are coming up. One is ugly and raw and in a way quietly heroic. The other is a riddle about trust and about how sometimes the people who need help the most might be the ones who put you at risk. Before I go on, a quick note. If you're someone who camps alone because you crave silence, I get it. I used to treasure solitude like a prize, but if you take anything from these 2.5 stories, let it be practical. Tell someone where you're going. Bring a charged phone and a backup battery. Pick sites that are not right next to people you don't know. If something feels off, trust that feeling. There's no shame in choosing company over solitude. The woods will wait. I'll see you back here for the next stories about things that happened under overpasses and with suits that don't belong in the backcountry. For now, keep your lights on and your ears open. I set my mug down and told myself this next one would be quieter. It wasn't. It never is. She called herself Maya when she wrote in. Maya is not her real name, but it's the name she wanted used, and that matters. Her email came with a single photo of a bridge taken from below, concrete ribs black with soot, a chain-link fence leaning like a tooth. I lived under there for a while, she wrote. It's not glamorous, it's survival. The way she told it, the overpass was less a place than a routine, a spot out of the weather, out of sight enough that the cops rarely bothered them, a small pocket of community under a highway that thundered like an unkind clock. If you've never slept under an overpass, imagine the steady vibration of traffic as a lullaby gone wrong. Oil smells the way old cities smell, soft and sharp at the same time. People come and go in cycles, a rotation of other campers, a woman who cooked on a hot plate, a man who collected cans and whistled too loudly. Maya liked that there were people. The presence of others felt like a perimeter. It felt safer than the woods can sometimes feel when no one means exactly that. Her tent was a small thing tucked between two concrete pillars, a place where the rain didn't find you, but the cold still did. She kept her belongings close. A backpack, a thermal blanket, a battered book of poetry she said she kept for the pretense of culture. Maya had reasons for being there that weren't heroic and didn't need explanation. Job loss, a lease that ended, the slow erasure of a savings account. She spoke plainly about it because survival doesn't like melodrama. One night, sometime late in the month when the city's rumble felt endless, someone attacked her tent. He came without a polite warning. Maya remembered hearing the fabric rip first, a sharp, thin sound like a fish being flensed. Then the light. A flashlight cutting the inside of her small house into silver. The man, she later described him as filthy, smelling like old urine and damp. The man thrust his head inside the tent and shouted. He had a box cutter in his hand. She could have screamed. She could have curled into a ball. She did none of those things by instinct. She acted like someone with nothing to lose, because sometimes that is the only kind of courage left. She grabbed the flap and shoved. The man lunged with the box cutter. The cut was quick and shallow. It could have been worse. He pulled the razor back like a child twice burned and slashed the tent again, angry at the resistance of canvas. Then he reached in. What followed is not for spectacle. It's for the record of what bodies remember. Maya fought. She hit him with what she had, an elbow, a fist, a shoe. She bit. She kicked. She grabbed his wrist and twisted until he dropped the box cutter, and when he tried again, she wrapped her legs around his waist like someone wrangling a desperate animal. She used a pocket of pepper spray she kept for cobras and dogs. She said she'd never expected to aim it at a human, but when fingers seek the inside of your tent, you stop ranking the morality of things and start tallying survival. Her voice when she told me this lowered. She didn't want the gory bits. She wanted the principle. At one point the attacker slashed through the canvas and the wind made the tent shiver. Maya's left ear filled with the sound of cars. Her heart beat a staccato. She remembers thinking very clearly that the only thing she wanted in the world at that moment was to breathe air that was not his smell. So she stood. She shoved him back with everything she had. He stumbled, swearing, and then, for reasons Maya never knew and which might have been chance or a final cowardly logic, he ran. She ran after him, or at least far enough to make sure he hadn't circled back. She banged on a neighbor's door, one of the few people she'd allowed herself to trust down there, and they called the police. The officers who showed up spoke to her gently but with routine distance, statements, photos, notes. They took the box cutter she'd managed to pry free. They asked if she wanted to press charges. She did. She did not want to be quiet about it, but she also knew the record of the street. She knew it often ended with a clean form and no long-term safety. She filed the statement because it mattered in a way that still mattered later. In the immediate hours, adrenaline was a strange, righteous friend. She was taken to a hospital. Minor lacerations, the sort of things that heal but leave you with a favor you can't pay back. The memory. The social worker came with pamphlets and a steady voice. There are shelters, they said. There are programs. They meant well. The world offered options that smelled bureaucratic and wet with waiting. Maya, who had built small, hard routines out of living on the margins, got angry at the polite offer of options, as if anger itself might forge a ladder. She would have to climb, and climbing takes time. What came after, for Maya, was not a tidy redemption arc. There was therapy, yes. She went to a free clinic and sat in rooms where strangers learned the contours of her panic. There was a court date scheduled that she later couldn't attend because life was logistics and nights were for work. There was a cousin who offered a couch that turned into a bed that turned into an apartment. There were small triumphs. A job application that wasn't lost in a pile, a paycheck that covered a month's rent when the landlord asked for it, with a tone that suggested he'd preferred cash under a door. Maya used the violence as combustible material. Not revenge, not exactly, more like a fuel that made her practical. She moved inside, slowly, as if shifting seasons. She also spoke about what it meant to be visible. People sometimes imagine homelessness as a moral failing, a failure to try hard enough. Maya insisted that violence against people without secure housing is not an accident of circumstance. It's a predictable vulnerability. She said she felt less safe sleeping under bridges than in a tiny rented room where the only horror was a leaky sink. I won't quote the legal outcome because she didn't provide one, and the records, when I asked, are often quiet. The attacker was described by a few witnesses as a local man known to the bridge. The police said they'd follow up. That's what the dispatchers often say. Whether they caught him or not is unconfirmed. In her reflection, she asked me to be blunt with the audience. Empathy isn't a substitute for policy. Saying, feel for people who live on the streets, feels performative when there's no action behind it. She urged people to donate to shelters, to volunteer time, to push for city services that keep people from sleeping under bridges in the first place. She also, in that honest, jagged way trauma survivors often have, told me she was proud of herself. I did what I had to do, she wrote. I fought. I didn't die. I used that to get out. It's a small, sharp kind of victory, but victories in these stories often are. There's a rhythm to these accounts I keep returning to. The idea that solitude can be a refuge and a trap at the same time. For some people, the woods are still the answer. For others, the city underbelly is where danger slides in. Which brings us to the last story, a different flavor of weird, the kind that tastes like business cards and trench coats. Find it's clean on the outside and messy in the middle. This final one is the one that still sits in my inbox, with 5-star discomfort attached to it. The submitter, call him Ryan, was a confident solo camper, the kind who'd been doing this for years, and who liked to think the unknown had a polite face. He'd been out in the backcountry for a long weekend, a section of trail that flirted with meadows and old logging roads. On a late afternoon, he came upon a man who did not belong on that trail. He was in a suit. Not a wrinkled plaid or a weathered jacket slapped on for warmth. He was in a proper suit, dark, the kind you imagine in an office that smells faintly of lemon polish. The man looked lost in the sort of way people look lost when something larger than navigation breaks inside them. He shuffled, hands in his pockets, eyes skittering to tree lines like someone who thought he might be tracked. Ryan stopped because you stop for people who look like they might be disoriented. It's basic human decency, seasoned with curiosity. "Are you okay?" Ryan asked. The man said he was being followed. His voice was low, hurried. He spoke of being in the wrong city, a wrong motel, then rambled into conspiratorial bits. "They'll get me. I can't let them find me." And Ryan, who'd assumed this was a nervous breakdown, offered to walk him to the trailhead. He was a long stretch to the parking lot, and Ryan thought it would be kinder to guide him. They walked in a silence that was not comfortable. The man, known from here on as the business guy, kept glancing over his shoulder. He refused to let Ryan put a hat on him to keep the sun from a sudden headache. He clutched a small leather bag like a talisman. His hands were calloused, which clipped against the polished image his suit projected. He said he'd left something important in his car. At one point he asked Ryan to keep watch while he disappeared into the trees for a minute. Ryan said no. He kept him talking instead. They reached the lot as twilight smudged the trail. Ryan handed the man a bottle of water and tried to find the part of his mind that would say, "This is probably harmless." The business guy's paranoia had a rhythm, an internal clock that beat to suspicion. When he asked if anyone had been following him, Ryan said he hadn't seen anyone. When the man asked to borrow Ryan's phone, he declined. He had a gut feeling that seemed to vibrate under his ribs. Those instincts, tacit and often mocked, tend to behave like streetlights. They warn before the car hits. That night, as Ryan slept in the honed comfort of a roofed campsite, headlights cut through his tarp. Two men in an unmarked vehicle pulled up. They were not in uniform. They had no badges displayed at first, just the kind of quiet entitlement that suggests paperwork somewhere else. They asked for the business guy. Ryan, still half asleep, explained the encounter. The men went where the business guy had been staying. They came back with him, and then they left. No explanation. No question and answer session. The man in the suit was taken into the vehicle without a sound, but with a kind of practiced economy that was weird to watch. Ryan asked them who they were. They said nothing except to show a card that had no jurisdiction he recognized. After they left the site, Ryan found two things missing. The leather bag the man had clutched was gone. the kind with worn edges that might have contained money or documents, and Ryan's own small pocket knife, which he'd left on a log near his tent, was missing too. He also woke in the morning to find his truck's rear tire slashed. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, and yet conclusions are the scaffolding humans build when puzzling things happen. He called the non-emergency number and filed a report about the slashed tire and the missing items. He told the dispatcher about the unmarked vehicle. "Could have been anything," the voice said. "Someone could have been investigating something." That was all the official voice would commit to. Ryan's aftertaste was a tangle of practical anger and a small unwelcome guilt. Had he enabled something? Was the man dangerous? Had the men who claimed to be agents been actually agents? No one provided him with a clear answer. The agency that should have been able to say something didn't. The missing knife and bag might have been petty theft. The slashed tire might have been revenge or coincidence. The thing that settled on Ryan like damp is the moral ambiguity of a stranger's need and your decision to help. There's also a quieter, creepier possibility Ryan couldn't shake. Maybe the man in the suit was the one being hunted. Maybe he'd been carrying things that made others interested for reasons beyond petty crimes. Maybe he was a con artist who used pathos to attract help. Maybe he was ill in a way that made him unpredictable. The more he thought, the more Ryan realized that sometimes aid isn't a simple moral ledger you can balance with a receipt. Sometimes it's a question mark taped to your windshield. His final reflection was not to stop helping. He didn't recommend isolationism, but he did advise caution. Meet people at visible places, do not offer personal information, stay near other people when guiding someone who seems off, and if anything feels wrong, escalate. Call rangers, park staff, or emergency services, rather than playing Good Samaritan on your own. He learned to trust the uneasy voice inside his neck that had said, "Keep the phone in hand. Don't hand over your keys." When Ryan pitched his story to me, he confessed an odd relief. He'd wanted the narrative closed, either heroic or criminal. Life, of course, refused to be neat. What remains is a bruise, a slashed tire, the missing pocket knife, and an ever-present filter of doubt about the rightness of interventions. So there they are, 5 nights that went sideways. The Johnsons with a truck pointing headlights like a weapon, Lena running from a man who seemed to worship tree sap, Marco listening to men around a dining table in the middle of nowhere, Maya fighting to keep herself whole under a bridge, and Ryan wondering whether he had helped someone in need or set something darker into motion. Each one resolves in a different way, some with the thin comfort of escape, some with the glue of police reports that never quite stick, some with the slow architecture of recovery. What do you do with that? The easy answer is to be terrified and avoid the woods forever. That's one option. The better answer is a mix of humility, preparation, and a small dose of paranoia. Paranoia as strategy, not as a life sentence. Here's what these 5 people taught me, distilled into things you can actually use. Tell someone where you're going. Not, "I might go camping next month," but specific. Trail name, campsite, approximate times. A single text can make a massive difference. Bring redundancy for your communication. A charged phone and a battery bank are minimal. A personal locator beacon or satellite messenger is better if you're off-grid. Don't rely on hope. Camp with others when you can. There are nights for solitude and nights for membership. If something feels off about a neighbor, too close, too noisy, too aggressively friendly, move or call the ranger. Trust small instincts. Small physical sensations, your stomach clenching, a hair standing up, are often the brain's early warning system. Act on them, move campsites, light your stove, put more distance between you and whatever feels wrong. Pack deterrents that are legal and familiar. Bear spray, whistles, bright flashlights. Know how to use them. Practice. There is no shame in choosing safety over a heroic story about being brave alone. If you see a crime or suspect one, document it safely. Note vehicle descriptions, take photos from a distance, call the non-emergency or emergency numbers depending on immediacy. Don't put yourself in the path of obvious danger for the sake of evidence. When interacting with vulnerable people, those living rough, disoriented strangers, practice both compassion and boundaries. Carry extra water or a meal and give contact numbers for shelters, or offer to walk someone toward a public place rather than into isolation. Safety for both parties matters. And finally, When something happens to you, don't let shame be part of the headline of your life. Reach out to friends, to hotlines, to professionals. Trauma is an expensive thing emotionally. Therapy and community are not signs of weakness, but of resourcefulness. I don't mean to end with a checklist, because lists can make horror feel like homework. But I do want to leave you with a last, quieter image. After each of these people left their moment, they carried a small practical object that mattered. A phone call, a scar, a court report, a rented room. Those objects were not cures, they were markers. They were proof that they had lived through something, and that survival often is less about heroics and more about the small repeated choices you make after the night. If you have a story, if something happened to you in the woods or under an overpass or on a road that didn't make sense, send it my way. We change the conversation by sharing details, by naming the patterns, by refusing to treat these things as anomalies. I read everything and I respect privacy. Use a pseudonym if you like. If you want to support this channel and get early access to episodes, there's a link in the description to a membership page where small contributions help keep research and outreach alive. Be careful out there. Bring a friend when you can. Tell someone where you're going. Keep your phone charged, your instincts on, and your empathy ready, but tempered by caution. The woods are beautiful, and they are indifferent. People, more than geography, are the variable that changes a place from safe to dangerous. Thank you for listening, and if you made it this far, consider sending in your own night story, anonymously or not, and we'll give it the respect it deserves.